At 11:47 p.m. on Thursday, March 14, 2024, Dubai Police Emergency Dispatch received a call that would expose one of the Emirates' most explosive scandals in recent history. The voice on the line belonged to Hassan Al-Mazroui, a 15-year veteran of private security and head of operations for Crown Palm Estate Elite Protection Services, one of Dubai's most discreet security firms catering exclusively to ultra-high net worth clients. His voice was steady, professional, but those who knew him well would have detected the underlying tremor of barely controlled panic. There's been a death at Sapphire Residence Tower, Unit 2804, overlooking the Persian Gulf, Hassan reported, his words carefully chosen. It appears to be a domestic incident. The involved party is still on scene and cooperative. That last word hung in the air with the weight of everything left unsaid. When the dispatcher pressed for details, Hassan added only, "You'll want to send your most experienced team. This situation is complicated." Complicated was an understatement that would become painfully clear within the hour. Sapphire Residence Tower stood as one of Dubai's architectural jewels, a gleaming 45-story monument to luxury rising from the city's most exclusive waterfront district. Units in this building didn't just cost millions, they required social vetting, background checks, and the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The lobby featured Italian marble imported specifically from the same quarry Michelangelo had used, and the concierge spoke 7 languages fluently. This was a building where privacy wasn't just expected, it was guaranteed. Until tonight, when Detective Rashid Al-Hamadi and his Criminal Investigation Division team arrived at 11:52 p.m., they found Hassan waiting in the hallway outside Unit 2804, his normally impeccable composure visibly fractured. This was a man trained to handle kidnapping threats, stalkers, and corporate espionage with ice-cold efficiency. Seeing him pale and shaken immediately told the detective this scene would be unlike anything routine. The apartment door stood open. What lay beyond would become seared into the memory of every investigator who entered. The living space itself was spectacular, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Persian Gulf, where lights from distant ships twinkled like fallen stars. The interior design spoke of expensive taste, cream-colored Italian leather furniture, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's homes, and that particular kind of cleanliness that comes from professional housekeeping rather than personal effort. But the carefully curated perfection had been violently disrupted. In the center of the living room, on marble floors so polished they reflected the overhead lighting like still water, lay the body of a small woman. Blood had pooled beneath her head where it had struck the floor, spreading in a dark halo that seemed obscene against the pristine white stone. She was still wearing light blue medical scrubs with a name embroidered in white thread across the chest pocket. Victoria Ramos, RN. Victoria Luz Ramos was 32 years old. Though she looked younger in death, her features relaxed in a way that suggested the struggle had been mercifully brief. Petechial hemorrhaging dotted her face and neck like terrible freckles, the telltale signature of asphyxiation. Her hands bore defensive wounds, fingernails broken and bloody from clawing at her attacker. The medical examiner would later note that she'd fought with the desperation of someone who knew exactly what was happening and refused to surrender easily. But it was the man standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows who commanded the room's attention. Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla, 44 years old, stood with his back partially turned, staring out at the Gulf as if the answers to impossible questions might be found in the darkness beyond the glass. He was still dressed in expensive casual wear, dark slacks and a white linen shirt now stained with blood that wasn't his own. Scratches marked his face and neck, defensive wounds inflicted by a woman fighting for her life. His hands trembled visibly, and when he finally turned to face the investigators, his eyes held the particular emptiness of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. To anyone following Dubai's society pages, Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla was a name synonymous with philanthropy and progressive healthcare initiatives. He was the third-generation scion of the Al-Mualla family, a dynasty built on oil wealth in the 1960s and carefully diversified into shipping, real estate, and telecommunications. The family's estimated net worth hovered around $8 billion, but Jamal had always positioned himself as different from the typical wealthy heir. He'd built hospitals across the UAE, funded medical research, appeared at charity galas with genuine passion for improving healthcare access. Gulf News had named him Humanitarian of the Year in 2018. His foundation had treated thousands of patients who couldn't afford private care. And now he stood in a luxury apartment, blood on his hands, over the body of his private nurse. The immediate crime scene told a story of escalating violence and frantic desperation. Furniture had been overturned, not in the chaos of struggle but in systematic searching. A pink iPhone lay near the kitchen island, its screen shattered into a spider web of cracks. Nearby, the scattered remains of what had been a MacBook Air, its screen torn from the keyboard, components yanked free with brutal force. An iPad, smashed beyond recognition. A designer handbag's contents spilled across the floor, wallet, makeup, receipts creating a trail of everyday life interrupted. But it was what the forensic team found stuffed hastily into a Louis Vuitton duffel bag that began to sketch the broader picture. More destroyed electronics, hard drives yanked from their casings, USB drives snapped in half, and stacks of cash. $100,000 in neat bundles, far too much money for a social visit, yet somehow not enough for whatever transaction had been intended. Detective Al-Hamadi, who had investigated murders ranging from honor killings to business disputes in his 18 years with Dubai police, recognized immediately that this was something different. The physical evidence, the players involved, the location, everything pointed to a case that would explode far beyond the confines of this apartment. This story stretched from the poverty-stricken streets of Manila's most desperate neighborhoods all the way to the golden penthouses of Dubai's most exclusive addresses. It was a collision between two worlds that should never have intersected, between wealth so vast it seemed infinite and poverty so grinding it shaped every decision. What investigators discovered in the following hours would reveal a web of addiction, forbidden love, blackmail, and ultimately murder. They would uncover video evidence that Victoria had carefully preserved, documenting a 14-month affair that exposed not just infidelity but drug addiction, business fraud, and the carefully constructed lies that held together a billionaire's public image. They would find messages detailing a blackmail demand that, in the context of Sheikh Jamal's wealth, seemed almost reasonable. $5 million, less than 0.2% of his family's net worth. A rounding error in their accounting. Yet somehow, that sum had been worth more to him than Victoria's life. But those discoveries would come later. In this moment, as forensic photographers documented the scene and investigators began their methodical collection of evidence, only the central terrible fact was undeniable. A woman lay dead, and the man who killed her stood waiting to face consequences that wealth and influence could no longer prevent. This is the story of two people from completely different worlds. One born into privilege so extreme it became its own kind of prison, trapped by expectations and family honor and the weight of a legacy he never asked for. The other born into poverty so desperate it shaped every choice, every sacrifice, every calculated decision made in the hope of building something better. Their paths should never have crossed. Victoria should have remained just another invisible migrant worker, one of the millions who power Dubai's luxury without ever partaking in it. Jamal should have remained in his carefully curated world of charity galas and business acquisitions, his private struggles hidden behind the fortress of wealth. But addiction opened a door. Vulnerability created a connection. And what began as a professional medical relationship evolved into something far more dangerous, a relationship built on unequal power, distorted perceptions, and the fatal mistake of confusing proximity to wealth with access to dignity. If you're drawn to stories that expose what happens when power, money, and desperation collide, you're going to want to stay with us for this entire journey. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what we uncover today will leave you questioning the true cost of wealth and the price people pay for proximity to power. What police discovered in Victoria's cloud storage would shock two continents. The trial that followed would force uncomfortable questions about how society values certain lives over others. And the ending, well, justice would be served, but at a cost neither family could have imagined. The question wasn't just who killed Victoria Luz Ramos. Everyone knew that from the moment police arrived. The question was why a man with everything would risk it all by strangling the one person who had seen him at his most vulnerable, and what that answer reveals about all of us. Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla wasn't born into royalty, but he might as well have been. When he entered the world on April 12, 1980, at the exclusive Royal Crescent Medical Center in Dubai, he arrived into a legacy 3 generations in the making, a family whose name carried weight not just in the Emirates but across the entire Gulf region. Understanding what happened in that apartment requires understanding the man, and understanding the man requires going back to the foundation his grandfather built in the burning desert heat of the early 1960s. His grandfather, Abdullah Al-Mualla, had been one of the original oil prospectors working in what would eventually become the United Arab Emirates, back when it was still the Trucial States and the massive wealth to come was nothing but geological theory and desperate hope. Abdullah wasn't an engineer or a geologist. He was a fixer, a negotiator, a man who could navigate the complex tribal politics of the region while simultaneously dealing with British petroleum executives who viewed the desert as nothing but untapped profit. When oil was finally struck in commercial quantities in 1962, Abdullah had positioned himself perfectly. He didn't own the oil, nobody did except the ruling families, but he owned access, relationships, and the kind of knowledge that turned modest investments into generational fortunes. By the time his son Rashid took over family operations in 1985, the Al Mualla fortune had already reached 8 figures. But Rashid possessed something his father lacked: formal Western education and an understanding that oil wealth was temporary. He diversified aggressively and strategically into shipping, establishing cargo routes between the Gulf and Asia when others still focused exclusively on petroleum. He bought real estate in London, New York, and Singapore before those markets exploded. He invested in telecommunications just as the mobile revolution began. When Jamal was born, the family net worth had crossed into the billions. By the time he was old enough to understand what wealth meant, his family controlled assets approaching $8 billion. Childhood for Jamal was gilded but suffocating. From age 5, he attended state functions, standing in miniature traditional dress beside his father as they cut ribbons on new developments, posed for photographs at charity events, represented the family at weddings and funerals of other prominent families. He learned early that his life wasn't entirely his own, that he was a symbol before he was a person, that every action reflected not just on himself but on generations of family honor. Education followed a predetermined path mapped out before he could voice preferences. Private tutors until age 12, teaching him Arabic, English, and French simultaneously, while drilling him in mathematics, sciences, and Islamic studies. Then the International School of Geneva for secondary education, where the children of diplomats, billionaires, and occasionally deposed royalty learned together in mountain-shadowed classrooms. Jamal excelled academically because failure wasn't an option, but his teachers noted he seemed more interested in biology and chemistry than in the business courses his father encouraged. At 17, during a summer break in Dubai, Jamal contracted a severe bacterial infection that hospitalized him for 3 months at Royal Zurich Medical Center, the family unwilling to trust local facilities despite their growing reputation. Those 3 months, isolated in a private wing with round-the-clock medical care, shaped him in ways his expensive education never had. He watched doctors work, saw nurses provide care that went beyond technical competence into genuine compassion, witnessed how medicine could restore not just physical health but human dignity. When he recovered, he announced to his father that he wanted to study medicine, to become a doctor, to actually help people rather than just manage money. The compromise reached was typical of wealthy families navigating between tradition and individual desire. Jamal would study politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford University, the degree that produced prime ministers and central bank governors, then pursue an MBA at International Business Academy London, specializing in healthcare investment. He could channel his medical interests into building hospitals rather than working in them, a path more suitable for someone of his position. Jamal, understanding this was the best offer he'd receive, accepted. Oxford and London Business School gave him the education his family wanted, but they also gave him something else, a taste of anonymity. In England, he was just another wealthy international student among hundreds. He could date British girls without family scrutiny, drink alcohol despite Islamic prohibitions, attend clubs and parties, and live like a normal young man in his 20s. For perhaps the only time in his life, expectations didn't suffocate every moment. When he graduated with his MBA in 2004 at age 24, returning to Dubai felt like walking back into a beautifully appointed prison. The marriages came quickly because in his social stratum, marriage wasn't primarily about love. It was about alliance, legacy, and social expectation. His first wife, Amira bint Abdullah, was selected by his family when Jamal was just 23. She was the daughter of a prominent banking family, educated at the Sorbonne, fluent in 4 languages, and exactly the kind of sophisticated partner expected for someone in his position. They married in 2003 in a ceremony that cost $3 million and was attended by government ministers and business titans from across the region. Amira was beautiful, intelligent, and understood perfectly the transactional nature of their union. She would manage his public image, host charity events, raise children properly, and in exchange receive security, status, and respect. They had 3 children together, sons Rashid and Abdullah, and daughter Fatima. The marriage worked because both parties understood and accepted its terms. His second marriage in 2008 to Layla bint Hamdan, a cousin from his mother's side, followed Islamic tradition and family expectation. Layla was quiet, deeply religious, and had no interest in public life. She focused entirely on raising their twin daughters, Noor and Hannah, and managing the household's religious education. She rarely appeared at public events and seemed content with that arrangement. But his third marriage in 2015 was different. Sheikh bint Khalifa was 26 years old when she married the then 35-year-old Jamal, 18 years his junior, ambitious, beautiful, and social media savvy in ways that sometimes embarrassed his more traditional family members. She posted Instagram photos from luxury vacations, shared glimpses of designer shopping trips, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention that came with the Al-Mualla name. They had one son together, Omar, now 8 years old. This marriage felt more like attraction than obligation, but even that relationship couldn't fill the growing emptiness Jamal felt. By his early 40s, Sheikh Jamal had achieved everything his family, his culture, and his society expected. He'd built the Al-Mualla Foundation for Healthcare, which had funded construction of Crescent Moon Children's Hospital in Dubai, Al-Mualla Medical Research Institute in Abu Dhabi, and Unity General Hospital in Sharjah. He appeared regularly in Gulf news profiles, was invited to speak at international healthcare conferences, and had received the Humanitarian of the Year award from the WHO in 2018. His 3 wives maintained separate households in different wings of the family compound. His children attended the finest schools, and his business empire continued expanding. From the outside, it looked like perfection. From the inside, it felt like slowly suffocating. Then came March 15, 2021, the day that would begin his unraveling. During a charity polo match at the Golden Sands Polo Club, an event he'd attended dozens of times, his horse stumbled at full gallop. The fall was catastrophic. Compound fracture of the femur, 3 broken ribs, severe trauma to his lower back. Emergency surgery at Platinum Tower Medical Center took 6 hours, leaving him with a titanium rod in his leg and a prescription that would destroy everything. OxyContin, 40 milligrams twice daily for pain management. At first, the medication was miraculous. The physical pain receded, but so did something else, the constant pressure of expectation, the suffocating weight of being Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla. On opioids, he could simply exist without the crushing anxiety of disappointing his family, his wives, his children, the thousands of patients who'd been treated at his hospitals. For the first time since those anonymous years in London, he felt like he could breathe. When his surgeon recommended tapering the medication after 6 months, Jamal realized he couldn't function without it. The pain had diminished, but his psychological dependence had grown absolute. He began seeing multiple doctors across different emirates, carefully crafting stories about persistent pain, getting separate prescriptions from physicians who didn't communicate with each other. By 2022, he was consuming over 200 milligrams daily, supplementing with Percocet, Tramadol, whatever he could acquire. His wives noticed the changes, the increasing isolation, the hours spent alone in his private wing, the mood swings and physical deterioration, but they attributed it to lingering pain and business stress. In their world, men didn't discuss vulnerabilities, and wives didn't pry into private medical matters. The addiction remained his terrible secret, a secret that demanded increasing effort to maintain. By late 2022, Sheikh Jamal knew he needed help, not rehab or addiction counseling. He couldn't risk anyone knowing, but medical management. Someone trained who could monitor his vitals, ensure he didn't overdose, administer medications properly, and most crucially, someone who had too much to lose to ever betray his confidence. He needed a private nurse, discreet, competent, and completely under his control. That's when Prestige Healthcare Staffing Dubai sent him Victoria Luz Ramos, the woman who would become first his caregiver, then his lover, then his blackmailer, and finally his victim. Neither of them could have known that their meeting would set in motion events that would destroy both their lives and expose secrets that 2 continents would be forced to confront. Victoria Luz Ramos was born on August 3, 1992, in Tanda, Manila, one of the most densely populated and desperately impoverished districts in the entire Philippines. If you've never seen Tanda, it's difficult to comprehend the level of poverty that exists there. Families of 8 living in cinder block structures barely large enough for a king-sized bed. corrugated metal roofs that turn homes into ovens during summer and leak like sieves during monsoon season. Open sewers running between houses where children play because there's nowhere else to go. Electricity that works maybe 6 hours a day if you're lucky. This wasn't just poverty. This was the kind of grinding, generational desperation that shapes every single decision a person makes from the moment they're old enough to understand that the world is fundamentally unfair. Victoria's mother, Rosa Ramos, worked 14-hour days in a garment factory in the Binondo district, hunched over industrial sewing machines in buildings with no air conditioning, producing designer knockoffs that would be sold in markets across Southeast Asia. She earned roughly $300 a month, every peso of which was already allocated before she received it. Rent for their tiny concrete house, rice and dried fish for meals, school fees for the children, the endless small expenses that accumulate when you're poor. There was never extra. There was never enough. Victoria's father, Carlos Ramos, had been a jeepney driver, one of the millions of men navigating Manila's chaotic streets in those colorful, exhaust-spewing vehicles that serve as the city's primary public transportation. He died when Victoria was 7 years old, his jeepney crushed between two delivery trucks during the evening rush hour on Metropolitan Highway, Manila's main artery. The other drivers took up a collection that paid for his funeral. There was no life insurance, no death benefits, no safety net of any kind. One day Victoria had a father who would lift her onto his shoulders and let her ring the jeepney's bell. The next day she had a memory and a mother who now carried the full weight of supporting 4 children alone. Those 4 children became Victoria's defining responsibility from an age when most kids worry only about homework and friends. Miguel, 3 years younger, who showed talent for fixing things but would need technical school training they couldn't afford. Sophia, 5 years younger, bright and artistic but destined for factory work unless someone intervened. And baby Paolo, 7 years younger, who was only 2 when their father died and would grow up never really knowing him. Victoria understood, even at 7 years old, that her childhood was over. Her mother needed help. Her siblings needed a future. And somehow she would have to provide it. School became Victoria's obsession because education was the only ladder out of Tonda that didn't require luck or connections. She attended Ramon Magsaysay Elementary School, a public institution with classes of 50 students sharing textbooks that were decades old and falling apart. While other children played during recess, Victoria studied. While they watched pirated movies on neighbors' televisions in the evening, she did homework by candlelight when the electricity was out, which was often. Her teachers noticed immediately. Here was a child who treated education like salvation because for her, it was exactly that. Her test scores were extraordinary. At 11 years old, she scored in the 98th percentile on the National Assessment Exam, earning her a scholarship to Manila Science High School, one of the city's most competitive public schools. This should have been purely good news, but it created new challenges. The school was across the city, requiring a 90-minute commute each way on crowded jeepneys, the same vehicles her father had driven. Victoria would wake at 4:30 every morning, help her mother prepare breakfast for her siblings, then begin the journey that required 3 different jeepney transfers through Manila's suffocating traffic. She'd arrive at school exhausted. She'd leave at 5 in the evening and arrive home after dark. Then she'd study for hours because maintaining her scholarship required staying in the top 10% of her class. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford, for maybe 5 hours a night for her entire adolescence. But she never complained. Her mother was working 14-hour days. Her siblings were depending on her. What right did she have to complain about being tired? At 16, Victoria made the most calculated decision of her young life. She would become a nurse. Not because she had some burning passion for healthcare, though she was good at science and genuinely cared about helping people. She chose nursing because the Philippines exports over 15,000 nurses annually to the Middle East, Europe, and North America. A Filipino nurse working in Dubai or Saudi Arabia could earn in 1 month what her mother made in an entire year. This wasn't a career choice. This was an economic strategy, a way to lift her entire family out of the poverty that had defined generations. The University of Santo Tomas, one of Manila's most prestigious institutions, offered full scholarships based on academic merit and financial need. Victoria's test scores and her family's economic situation made her an ideal candidate. She was accepted in 2008 with a full 4-year scholarship covering tuition, but not living expenses, not books, not the countless other costs that come with university education. So Victoria worked nights at a 24-hour convenience store near the campus, standing behind bulletproof glass selling cigarettes and instant noodles to customers who sometimes tried to rob the place. She'd work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., attend classes from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., study until 9 p.m., then return to work. 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night became her permanent reality. Her university classmates thought she was unfriendly, cold even, because she never socialized, never attended parties, rarely even made small talk. They didn't understand that she couldn't afford the luxury of friendship. Every moment not spent studying or working was a moment stolen from her family's future. While they worried about dating and weekend plans, Victoria was calculating how to send more money home, how to pay for Miguel's technical training, how to cover Sophia's high school fees. She graduated in 2012 in the top 10% of her nursing class, an achievement made more remarkable by the fact that she'd done it while working full-time and supporting her family. She passed the Philippine Nursing Board exam on her first attempt, scoring in the 85th percentile. At 20 years old, Victoria Luz Ramos had accomplished what she'd set out to do. She was a licensed registered nurse with credentials that would work anywhere in the world. Now came the part that would define the next decade of her life, leaving the Philippines to work in the Gulf. Her first position came through a recruitment agency that specialized in placing Filipino healthcare workers in Middle Eastern hospitals. The contract was with King Abdullah International Medical Center in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The salary was $2,800 monthly, nearly 10 times what she could earn in Manila. But the contract came with conditions that would have made anyone pause. Her passport would be held by her employer, standard practice in the Gulf's kafala sponsorship system but technically illegal. She couldn't leave Saudi Arabia without explicit employer permission. She'd live in a compound with other Filipino nurses, 6 women sharing a 3-bedroom apartment. Work shifts would be 12 hours minimum, often extending to 14 or 16 when the hospital was busy. She'd have 1 day off weekly if staffing allowed. She could expect to be treated as second class by Saudi administrators and doctors, her medical opinions dismissed, her complaints ignored. Victoria signed the contract without hesitation. Because $2,800 monthly meant she could send $2,000 home and still live reasonably on $800. It meant Miguel could attend technical school. It meant Sophia could continue her education instead of dropping out at 16 to work in factories. It meant Paolo could have the childhood she'd never had. Saudi Arabia was everything the stories warned about and worse. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts in emergency departments where she'd see things that would haunt her. Car accident victims who arrived already dead, but whose families demanded futile resuscitation attempts. Foreign workers who'd suffered industrial accidents and had no insurance. Women who came in with injuries they'd lie about because admitting domestic abuse would only make things worse. The cultural environment was suffocating for a young woman who'd grown up with relative freedom in the Philippines. She couldn't leave the compound without covering herself completely. She couldn't speak to men who weren't relatives or co-workers. She certainly couldn't date or have any semblance of a personal life. But the hardest part was watching the massive gulf between how wealthy Saudi families were treated versus how migrant workers were treated in the same hospital. She'd see Saudi patients in private wings with around-the-clock private nurses, the latest treatments, whatever they wanted regardless of medical necessity. Then she'd see Filipino construction workers dying from preventable diseases because they couldn't afford the treatment, because their employers wouldn't authorize payment, because in the Gulf's economic hierarchy, their lives simply mattered less. The injustice burned inside Victoria, but she learned to smile, to be deferential, to become invisible in the way that survival sometimes requires. She learned to anticipate what wealthy patients wanted before they asked. She mastered the art of discretion, understanding that what she saw in private hospital rooms stayed there absolutely. She became fluent in medical Arabic, picking up the language through immersion and necessity. Over 6 years, she built a reputation among wealthy Saudi families as trustworthy and competent, the 2 qualities that mattered most when you were sick and vulnerable and wanted someone around who wouldn't gossip about your private medical issues. By 2018, Victoria had achieved something remarkable for someone from her background. She'd put Miguel through technical school. He was now a certified electrician earning decent money. She'd funded Sophia's university education. Her sister was studying accounting. She'd supported Paolo through high school and into college. She'd helped her mother buy a small house in a better neighborhood. Nothing fancy but concrete walls and reliable electricity and running water. She'd lifted her entire family out of Tonda, out of the desperate poverty that had defined their lives. But she'd sacrificed everything personal to do it. At 26 years old, Victoria had never had a serious relationship. She'd gone on maybe 3 dates in her entire life, brief awkward meetings that went nowhere because she couldn't afford the emotional investment. She had no real friends, just work colleagues she was cordial with. She owned nothing except practical necessities and the growing balance in her savings account. She was successful by every measure that mattered to her family, but she was also profoundly, achingly lonely. In 2019, an opportunity emerged that seemed almost too good to be true. Prestige Healthcare Staffing Dubai, an elite agency providing private medical professionals exclusively to ultra-high net worth clients, recruited her based on her reputation in Riyadh. Their client list included sheikhs, international businessmen, celebrities, foreign dignitaries, people whose names appeared in newspapers and whose privacy was paramount. The base salary was $8,000 monthly plus housing allowance and health insurance. But more importantly, Dubai offered something Saudi Arabia never had: freedom. She could leave her apartment without covering her face. She could socialize. She could actually have a life beyond work. The assignments varied. She cared for an aging British petroleum executive with stage 4 cancer, managing his pain and decline with as much dignity as possible. She provided post-operative care for a Russian oligarch's wife after extensive cosmetic surgery, monitoring for complications while pretending not to notice how much work had been done. She handled 24/7 monitoring for a Saudi princess with severe anorexia, a situation that required medical expertise and extraordinary emotional intelligence. Victoria earned a reputation within Prestige Healthcare for 3 things. First, medical competence. She caught complications before doctors did, her clinical skills honed by years in high-pressure emergency environments. Second, emotional intelligence. She made patients feel cared for rather than managed, a skill that wealthy people who could buy anything valued enormously. Third, absolute discretion. She never gossiped, never leaked information, never judged no matter what she witnessed. In the world of ultra-wealthy private care, these 3 qualities made her invaluable. By November 2022, Victoria was 30 years old, professionally accomplished, and financially secure in ways she'd never imagined possible growing up in Tonda. She'd saved over $200,000. She owned a modest condo in Manila that she rented out for income. Her family was stable. For the first time in her life, she could actually think about her own future rather than just surviving month to month. That's when Prestige Healthcare called with a new assignment. The client was Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla, a name she recognized from news coverage of his philanthropic work. The official reason given was post-surgical recovery care following an orthopedic procedure. The real reason, unstated but understood by everyone involved, was whatever the client actually needed with no questions asked. The compensation was $15,000 monthly, the highest she'd ever been offered. The duration was initially 3 months, renewable based on the client's needs. Victoria took the assignment seeing only the mathematics. $15,000 monthly meant she could save $10,000 and still live very comfortably on 5. At that rate, she could save enough for a real future, maybe open a small medical clinic back in Manila serving poor communities, maybe finally think about marriage and family, maybe stop living like every month might be her last. She had no idea she was walking into the most dangerous relationship of her life. She couldn't have known that the man who needed her medical expertise was also a drug addict whose desperation would become entangled with attraction in ways that would destroy them both. She didn't understand that proximity to his wealth would make her believe she deserved access to his world, that 14 months of intimacy would make her feel entitled to compensation when he discarded her, that her very reasonable demand for respect would cost her everything. On November 15, 2022, Victoria Luz Ramos arrived at Sheikh Jamal's Crown Palm Estate mansion carrying her medical bag and her carefully constructed emotional armor. She was a professional. She'd handled dozens of wealthy clients. This would be no different. She'd do her job, collect her generous salary, and continue building toward the future she'd sacrificed so much to achieve. But when she met Sheikh Jamal for the first time, when she saw the pain in his eyes that wasn't just physical, when he looked at her like she was a person rather than hired help, something shifted. For a woman who'd spent her entire life being invisible, being strong, being the one everyone else depended on, being seen by someone like him felt intoxicating, dangerous, irresistible. Within months, she would cross every professional boundary she'd ever maintained. Within a year, she'd convince herself that what they had was real, that she mattered to him beyond her utility. And when she finally understood the truth, when she realized she'd been nothing but convenient and disposable, her response would set in motion the events that would end with her dead on a marble floor and him in handcuffs, two people from opposite worlds who'd collided with devastating consequences. November 15, 2022. The date would later be marked in police reports as the beginning of a relationship that would end in murder 14 months later. Victoria's taxi pulled up to the gates of Sheikh Jamal's Crown Palm estate at exactly 2 p.m. The punctuality drilled into her from years of professional medical work where being late could mean missing a critical medication window or emergency situation. But nothing in her professional experience had prepared her for the sheer scale of wealth she was about to witness. The estate sprawled across nearly 3 acres of reclaimed land on one of the Palm's most exclusive fronds, a curved strip of artificially created beachfront where properties started at $40 million and went up from there. The main house was a contemporary architectural masterpiece, 25,000 square feet of white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass that seemed to float above perfectly manicured lawns. An infinity pool stretched along the Gulf-facing side, its edge dissolving into the horizon so seamlessly it looked like the water continued forever. A helicopter pad occupied one corner of the property. Security cameras were positioned every 20 feet, discreet but visible enough to send a message about privacy and protection. A member of the household staff, a Filipina woman in her 50s who introduced herself simply as Marie, escorted Victoria inside. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from someone with unlimited resources and access to the world's best designers. Italian marble floors so polished they reflected like mirrors. Original artwork that Victoria didn't recognize but that probably cost more than her lifetime earnings. Furniture that managed to look both impossibly expensive and somehow comfortable. The air conditioning was set to perfect temperature, the kind of climate control that requires massive energy expenditure but ensures complete comfort. Marie led her through the main living areas toward the east wing, explaining the layout as they walked. Sheikh Jamal's 3 wives maintained separate residences in the north and west wings, she said matter-of-factly, as if having 3 wives was the most normal thing in the world. The east wing is the Sheikh's private quarters. You'll be working primarily there. He values his privacy very much. The private wing was essentially a self-contained luxury apartment within the larger mansion. Living area, bedroom suite, office, and what Marie called the medical suite, a room that had been converted specifically for Victoria's use. It contained a hospital-grade adjustable bed, monitoring equipment that looked brand new and top of the line, a locked medication safe built into the wall, and medical supplies that would stock a small clinic. Adjacent to this was what would be Victoria's bedroom, a converted guest suite with its own bathroom, a queen-sized bed, and a small sitting area. The message was immediately clear. She was expected to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sheikh Jamal appeared 30 minutes later, and Victoria's first impression was of someone carrying invisible weight. He was 43 years old but looked older, lines around his eyes that suggested chronic pain or chronic stress or both. He walked with a barely perceptible limp, favoring his right leg, and she noticed how he winced almost imperceptibly when he lowered himself into a chair. He was dressed casually in expensive athletic wear, the kind of clothes that cost hundreds of dollars to look deliberately simple. "Miss Ramos," he said, his English perfect with a slight British accent from his Oxford years. "Thank you for taking this assignment. I understand Prestige Healthcare spoke with you about my needs." They had, though the conversation had been deliberately vague. Post-surgical pain management following a polo accident and orthopedic reconstruction. Monitoring for complications. Assistance with physical therapy exercises. Medication administration. Everything a private nurse would typically handle for a wealthy patient recovering from surgery. What they hadn't mentioned, what became obvious to Victoria within the first 48 hours, was that Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla was deep in the grip of opioid addiction. The signs were everywhere once you knew what to look for. The medications he'd listed when they first met were standard post-surgical prescriptions, OxyContin, Percocet, Tramadol, all legitimate for someone managing chronic pain. But the dosages he was taking were far higher than what his medical records indicated. She controlled the medication safe, but within 3 days she found hidden pill bottles in his bathroom cabinet, in his bedroom nightstand drawer, in his office desk. The bottles had different doctors' names, different pharmacies, all recent prescriptions. He was doctor shopping, seeing multiple physicians across Dubai and getting separate prescriptions from each, a classic pattern of addiction. Victoria faced a moral calculation that would define everything that followed. The ethical thing, the professional thing, would be to report this to Prestige Healthcare, to recommend he get proper addiction treatment, to extract herself from a situation that violated every standard of medical practice. But she understood the reality with brutal clarity. If she reported him, he'd fire her immediately and hire someone more willing to enable him. She'd lose the $15,000 monthly salary. Her family depended on that money. Miguel was using the funds she sent to expand his electrical business. Sofia had just started graduate school. Paulo needed support through his final year of university. Her mother's diabetes medication was expensive, so Victoria rationalized. She told herself she was actually helping him by being there. At least under her care, he was getting clean needles for injections, proper dosages instead of random amounts, medical monitoring that could catch an overdose before it killed him. Without her, he might die from street pills of inconsistent strength or from mixing medications dangerously. She was keeping him alive, even if she was also enabling his addiction. It was easier to believe this than confront the truth that she was choosing money over ethics. The first month was strictly professional despite the moral compromise. December 2022 passed with Victoria maintaining rigid boundaries. Their interactions were clinical. She administered medications on schedule, monitored his vital signs 3 times daily, documented everything in meticulous medical charts, supervised his physical therapy exercises. She learned his schedule. Mornings were for business calls to partners in London and New York, time zones requiring him to work when Dubai was still sleeping. Afternoons in his office managing his foundation's operations, reviewing hospital construction projects, handling the endless administrative work of running a billion-dollar portfolio. Evenings alone in his wing, which was when he took his highest doses and disappeared into the chemical comfort that made everything else bearable. His 3 wives visited, but rarely and always on what felt like scheduled appointments. Amira would appear every Sunday at 3 p.m., discuss household business, review schedules for their children's activities, handle foundation event planning. Their interactions were cordial but distant, more like business partners than spouses. Layla came perhaps once every 2 weeks, usually to discuss religious education for the children or family obligations. She barely acknowledged Victoria's presence, and Victoria got the sense Layla preferred it that way. Sheikh visited more frequently but briefly, usually wanting something: permission for a vacation, approval for a purchase, access to funds for one project or another. None of them seemed particularly interested in their husband's medical condition or recovery. The relationship was transactional on all sides. January 2023 brought the first cracks in Victoria's professional armor. Sheikh Jamal began talking more during medication administration, conversations that started neutral and gradually became personal. He discussed Dubai's rapid development, his foundation's latest projects, the challenge of building hospitals in developing regions. Then he'd shift to more revealing topics: the pressure of managing 3 separate households, the impossibility of meeting everyone's expectations, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from him rather than actually knowing him. Victoria listened professionally at first, offering appropriate responses without getting personal. But she recognized something in his isolation that resonated with her own experience. She'd spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who depended on her. Her family needed money, her patients needed care, everyone wanted something, but nobody really saw her as a complete person with her own needs and desires. They were both, in very different ways, trapped by other people's expectations. The moment everything changed came on a January evening during a particularly severe withdrawal episode. Sheikh Jamal had tried to reduce his dosage on his own, a dangerous decision without medical supervision. By evening he was experiencing full withdrawal symptoms: sweating, trembling, severe anxiety, nausea. Victoria stayed with him, monitoring his vitals, talking him through it, holding his hand when the tremors got bad. It was just a gesture of comfort, the kind of thing nurses do for patients in distress. But when the worst had passed and he looked at her with genuine gratitude, something shifted between them. "I can't stop," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I've tried. Every time I reduce the dosage, I feel like I'm dying. Not just the physical pain, everything. All the pressure, all the expectations, it all comes crashing back and I can't breathe." Victoria should have maintained professional distance, should have recommended psychiatric care, addiction treatment, proper medical intervention. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "You're not alone in this. I'm here." It was the truth, but it was also the beginning of something that would destroy them both. February 2023. Valentine's Day, though neither of them acknowledged it directly. Sheikh Jamal had a particularly difficult day. A major business deal had collapsed, costing his company tens of millions. He'd had an argument with Amira about family finances, her accusing him of being irresponsible with foundation funds. He'd taken a higher dose of medication than usual, and Victoria noticed but said nothing because saying something would mean confronting how far beyond professional boundaries they'd already drifted. That evening he talked for hours about loneliness, about being surrounded by people who saw him as a title or a bank account rather than a person. "You're different," he said, his voice soft from the drugs. "You see me. Not Sheikh Jamal al-Mualla, just Jamal. Just a person who's in pain and trying to survive." Victoria wanted to believe it. God, she wanted to believe it so desperately, because she'd spent 30 years being invisible, being the strong one, being the person everyone else leaned on. The idea that someone like him, someone with everything, actually saw her as more than hired help, as someone valuable beyond her utility, it was intoxicating. When he leaned in to kiss her, she didn't pull away. The affair that followed was intense and completely unequal from the start, though Victoria couldn't or wouldn't see it. Sheikh Jamal began spending every evening in his private wing with her, away from his wives, his children, his obligations. He showered her with gifts that represented wealth beyond anything she'd ever imagined. Louis Vuitton handbags that cost more than her mother's annual income. Cartier jewelry with diamonds that caught light like captured stars. Designer clothes in sizes he somehow knew perfectly. Clearly he'd been studying her. Cash bonuses of $5,000, $10,000, handed over casually with phrases like, "Because you take such good care of me." In May 2023, he surprised her with an apartment. A two-bedroom unit on the 28th floor of Sapphire Residence Tower, floor-to-ceiling windows with panoramic Gulf views, fully furnished with expensive taste, her name on the lease, rent paid annually in advance. Victoria was overwhelmed. She'd never had her own apartment in her entire life. In Manila, she'd shared rooms with siblings. In Riyadh, she'd lived with roommates in compound housing. In Dubai, she'd been living in his mansion. This space was hers, only hers, and it felt like validation, proof that she mattered to him, that this was real. The following month brought a white Mercedes E-Class sedan, registered in her name. She'd never owned a car. Suddenly, she was driving past Filipina domestic workers waiting at bus stops in the heat, and she felt both pride and guilt. Pride because she'd made it. She'd transcended the immigrant worker status that kept millions trapped in servitude. Guilt because she knew exactly how she transcended it, by becoming the secret mistress of a married billionaire, by compromising everything she'd once believed about herself. But the gifts made it easier to believe the fantasy. If he was spending this kind of money on her, surely it meant something. Surely he cared. Surely this was more than just convenience. That's when Victoria began recording their intimate moments on her phone. She told herself it wasn't for blackmail, not initially. She wanted proof this was real. Proof that Sheikh Jamal al-Mualla, billionaire philanthropist, actually cared about Victoria Ramos from Tonda. Evidence for herself that she wasn't just hired help who happened to be sleeping with her employer. She wanted to be able to look at these videos years later and remember that once, someone like him had chosen someone like her. The footage accumulated over months. Intimate moments in his bedroom, but also conversations that were far more dangerous. Him administering his own drug injections when he thought she wasn't recording. Discussions about his marriages where he called Amira a business partner, not a wife, and said Layla was too traditional, we have nothing in common, and dismissed Sheikha as beautiful but vapid. Business conversations where he casually mentioned bribing government officials for hospital construction permits. Disparaging comments about business partners and family members, the kind of things you say in private when you trust someone completely. Victoria wasn't naive. She knew phones could be taken, damaged, destroyed. Everything automatically uploaded to her private cloud account, encrypted, backed up in multiple folders. She told herself this was just being careful. But some part of her knew it was insurance. Because women like her didn't end up with men like him in fairy tale endings. Eventually, she'd be discarded. And when that happened, she wanted leverage. The turning point came faster than she expected. By August 2023, 8 months into their affair, Sheikh Jamal was making promises. Late-night conversations about their future. vague mentions of restructuring his assets, setting up independent accounts, changing his life once his children were older. "You'll never have to worry about money again," he'd say, and Victoria desperately wanted to believe him. September shattered the fantasy. Amira confronted him about another woman, her suspicions raised by his increasing absences and obvious distraction. For a week, he didn't visit Victoria's apartment. He sent only brief texts, dealing with family situation. "Be patient." Victoria felt the first real tremor of panic. Maybe she was disposable after all. Maybe proximity to wealth didn't mean access. Maybe she'd been fooling herself all along. When he finally returned in October, everything had changed. The conversation was different, more clinical, less intimate. He mentioned needing to reduce their time together, just temporarily. When Victoria asked about the promises he'd made, his response was devastating in its casual cruelty. "You have to understand my position, my family, my reputation, everything I've built. Surely you understand." The unspoken message was clear. You're not worth risking everything for. November 2023 brought the final betrayal. Sheikh Jamal casually mentioned he'd be transitioning to a different nurse, said it like he was changing phone service providers. "Sheikha has questions about why I need so much medical care. Better to make a clean break before suspicions grow. Don't worry, I'll make sure you're taken care of financially." Something shattered inside Victoria in that moment. 14 months of her life. She'd compromised her professional ethics, her personal dignity, her sense of self. She'd believed she was special, different, valued. But in his mind, she'd always been just expensive hired help. Discardable, replaceable, forgettable. That night, alone in the apartment he'd given her, Victoria reviewed all her video footage. Hours of evidence showing Dubai's beloved philanthropist drug-addicted, cheating on 3 wives simultaneously, discussing illegal business practices, mocking his family and associates. Vulnerable, compromised, exposed. She spent 3 days crafting her message. Professional, businesslike, treating it like a negotiation because that's what this had always been, even when she'd fooled herself into thinking it was love. $5 million and help securing permanent residency in Canada. In exchange, complete deletion of all files and absolute confidentiality. In her mind, this was fair compensation. She'd given him 14 months, risked her career, been his secret. $5 million was less than 0.2% of his family's wealth. He'd spent more on a single vacation property. What Victoria didn't understand, what she couldn't understand coming from her world, was that for men like Sheikh Jamal al-Mualla, this wasn't about money. It was about control. It was about reputation. It was about family honor. And when those things were threatened, wealthy men didn't negotiate. They eliminated threats. When she pressed send on that WhatsApp message at 11:43 p.m. on December 2, 2023, attaching the 3-minute compilation video as proof she was serious, Victoria Luz Ramos sealed her own fate. She had 72 hours to live, though she didn't know it yet. She thought she was finally taking control of her life, demanding respect, ensuring her future. Instead, she just guaranteed she had no future at all. December 2, 2023, 11:43 p.m. Victoria's finger hovered over the send button for nearly 30 seconds before she finally pressed it. The WhatsApp message transmitted instantly, the double checkmarks appearing immediately to confirm delivery, then turning blue within seconds to show he'd read it. Somewhere across Dubai, in his private wing of the Crown Palm Mansion, Sheikh Jamal al-Mualla was staring at his phone screen, watching his entire world begin to collapse. The message Victoria had crafted was professional, almost businesslike in its tone. She'd written and rewritten it dozens of times over 3 days, trying to find the balance between firm and threatening, between demanding and desperate. "Jamal, I've thought carefully about our situation. You said you'd take care of me financially. Here's what I need to move forward with my life and maintain my discretion. $5 million transferred to my account, assistance securing permanent residency in Canada, and a letter of recommendation for international nursing positions. In exchange, all video files permanently deleted, complete confidentiality about our relationship. This is fair compensation for 14 months of my life and the professional risks I took caring for you. I hope you'll see this as a reasonable business arrangement between 2 people who once cared for each other." Attached to the message was a 3-minute video compilation she'd edited together from the hundreds of hours of footage stored in her cloud account. The clips were chosen strategically for maximum impact. Him self-administering opioid injections, the needle sliding into his arm with practiced ease that spoke of long addiction. Audio of him discussing bribing government officials, casually mentioning $50,000 payments to ministry officials to expedite hospital construction permits. Intimate footage that clearly showed both their faces, leaving no possibility of denial. A clip where he called Amira a cold business arrangement I was forced into, and said his children wouldn't understand the pressure of being born into this family. Timestamps in the corner of each clip proving the footage spanned 14 months, showing this wasn't a brief affair but a sustained relationship. The final line of her message was the explicit threat that transformed this from a request into blackmail. You have 72 hours to respond. Otherwise, Gulf News, Al Jazeera, and your foundation's board of directors all receive copies. I'm not trying to destroy you, Jamal. I'm trying to survive. But I will do what I must. Sheikh Jamal watched that 3-minute compilation 7 times in the first hour after receiving it. Each viewing made his hands shake more violently. By the 3rd viewing, he'd vomited in his private bathroom, the physical manifestation of panic overwhelming his system. By the 5th viewing, he'd taken double his normal evening dose of OxyContin, seeking the chemical numbness that made everything bearable. By the 7th viewing, something had shifted in his mind from panic to rage. How dare she? After everything he'd given her? The apartment worth over $1 million. The Mercedes, the jewelry and designer clothes, the cash bonuses that totaled well over $200,000 across 14 months. He'd elevated her from nothing, from being just another immigrant nurse working for wages, to living a lifestyle she never could have imagined. She should have been grateful. She should have accepted his generous severance offer and disappeared quietly back to whatever poverty she'd come from. Instead, she was threatening to destroy everything he'd built, everything his family had built across 3 generations because she felt entitled to more. At 2:17 a.m., unable to sleep, unable to think clearly through the combination of drugs and panic, Sheikh Jamal called Hassan al-Mazroui. Hassan had been the Al-Muallaf family's head of security for 15 years, a former Dubai police officer who'd transitioned to private security and proven himself ruthlessly effective at handling delicate situations. He'd made problems disappear before, stalkers who got too close to family members, business partners who threatened lawsuits, journalists who asked uncomfortable questions. Hassan knew how to apply the right combination of money, pressure, and occasionally implied threats to make difficulties evaporate. "We have a situation," Sheikh Jamal said when Hassan answered, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I need you to come to the estate. Now. Alone." Hassan arrived within 20 minutes, found Sheikh Jamal in his private office, the 3-minute video playing on loop on his laptop. Hassan watched it once in silence, his expression never changing, the professional mask he'd perfected over years of handling wealthy clients' messy secrets. "How bad is the full footage?" Hassan asked. "Hours of it. Everything. The drugs, business discussions, all of it." Hassan was quiet for a long moment, running calculations. "Options," he finally said. "We pay her and hope she keeps quiet, though blackmailers rarely stop at one payment. We pursue legal action for invasion of privacy and illegal recording, but that exposes everything we want hidden in court proceedings." Or, he left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air between them. "I can't let this get out," Sheikh Jamal said. "My wives, my children, the foundation, everything would be destroyed. My family's reputation, 3 generations of building respect and honor, gone because of some nurse who got ideas above her station." "Let me handle initial contact," Hassan suggested. "Sometimes these situations resolve with the right conversation, the right pressure applied in the right places. Give me 24 hours before you do anything." But Sheikh Jamal was already spiraling beyond rational decision-making. The drugs, the panic, the narcissistic rage at being challenged by someone he considered beneath him, all of it was pushing him toward a decision that would destroy both their lives. December 3rd passed in failed negotiations. Hassan attempted to make contact with Victoria through intermediaries, feeling out her position, her seriousness, her flexibility. Victoria's response was unwavering. $5 million and Canada residency assistance. Non-negotiable. The deadline was firm. December 4th brought Sheikh Jamal's attempted counteroffer. A message sent at 3 p.m., $500,000 as a goodwill settlement. "You must understand I have a family to protect." This is a generous offer considering everything you've already received. Victoria's response came back within minutes, and the speed of it told him she'd been waiting, preparing her reply. You have $3.2 billion. I'm asking for 0.15% of your net worth. I have screenshots of property transactions where you spent more on a vacation home in Monaco. This isn't negotiable. $5 million or the videos go public. 48 hours remaining. The refusal to negotiate, the specificity of her knowledge about his finances, the cold calculation in her response, all of it transformed Sheikh Jamal's panic into something darker. She wasn't just asking for money. She was demonstrating that she'd studied him, researched him, knew exactly what he was worth, and had calculated down to the percentage point what she believed she deserved. This wasn't desperation. This was premeditated exploitation, or at least that's how he'd convinced himself to see it. December 5th, the final day of Victoria's 72-hour deadline, Sheikh Jamal barely slept. He consumed enough opioids to kill someone without his tolerance, seeking oblivion but finding only a chemically enhanced version of his rage. By evening, he'd made his decision, though he wouldn't consciously admit to himself what he was planning. He told Amira he was traveling to Abu Dhabi for an emergency foundation board meeting. He told Hassan to stay at the estate, that he'd handle this personally, that sometimes direct conversation was more effective than intermediaries. He withdrew $100,000 in cash from his private safe, stacking the bills in a Louis Vuitton duffel bag. He left his personal phone at the mansion and activated a burner phone he'd purchased that afternoon from an electronics shop in a neighborhood where nobody would recognize him. He drove himself in his personal Mercedes S-Class, unusual behavior for someone who almost never traveled without security. Every decision pointed toward premeditation, toward planning for violence rather than negotiation. But Sheikh Jamal had convinced himself he was going to negotiate, to make Victoria see reason, to resolve this without anyone getting hurt. The cash was good faith. The burner phone was just privacy. The lack of security was to keep the meeting discreet. He needed to believe these lies because acknowledging the truth, that he was planning to silence her permanently, would have meant confronting what he'd become. At 9:15 p.m. on March 14, 2024, Sheikh Jamal pulled into the underground parking garage of Sapphire Residence Tower. Security footage would later show him sitting in his car for 7 minutes and 32 seconds before getting out, visible through the windshield talking to himself, hands gripping the steering wheel, working up courage or rage or some volatile combination of both. Victoria had been checking her phone obsessively for 3 days. The 72-hour deadline had passed that afternoon at 11:43 a.m., exactly 72 hours after she'd sent the initial message. She'd expected him to cave before the deadline, to transfer the money and negotiate terms. When the deadline passed with no response, she'd begun to actually compile the contact information for journalists at Gulf News, unsure if she could really go through with it but needing him to believe she would. When her apartment buzzer rang at 9:23 p.m. and the doorman announced, "Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla to see you, Miss Ramos," her heart rate spiked. He'd come. He was taking this seriously. They could negotiate face-to-face and resolve this like adults. She'd get her money, her fresh start, her compensation for everything she'd sacrificed. Everything would work out. She opened the door to Unit 2804 at 9:24 p.m. Sheikh Jamal entered carrying the duffel bag, and for a moment they just looked at each other, two people who'd been intimate for 14 months now facing each other as adversaries. He looked terrible, she noticed. Weight loss made his expensive clothes hang slightly loose. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes. A tremor in his hands that suggested he was either in withdrawal or had taken too much trying to calm his nerves. "Let's discuss this like reasonable adults," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I've been nothing but reasonable," Victoria replied, gesturing him toward the living room. "Did you bring what I asked for?" He set the duffel bag on her glass coffee table and unzipped it, revealing stacks of bills. "I brought a significant amount of cash as good faith. $100,000. Victoria's face fell as she stared at the money. 100,000. Not even 2% of what she'd demanded. "This isn't even close to what I asked for," she said, her voice rising despite her attempt to stay calm. "It's more than generous considering everything you've already received," Sheikh Jamal shot back, his carefully controlled tone beginning to crack. "The apartment, the car, the gifts, you've been compensated extremely well." "Compensated?" Victoria's voice went sharp. "You think a few presents cover 14 months of lying to everyone about us? 14 months of being your secret? Of risking my career, my reputation, everything. What did you expect? The contempt was creeping into his voice now, the mask of civility slipping. That I'd divorce my wives for you? Marry my nurse? Introduce you to my family as what, exactly? The way he said my nurse, the dismissive tone that reduced her to nothing but hired help, cut Victoria deeper than any insult could have. All the fantasies she'd built, all the times she'd convinced herself she mattered to him, all of it evaporated in that moment of casual cruelty. I expected basic respect, she said, her voice shaking. I expected you to honor your promises. You said you'd take care of me. And I am, he insisted. $100,000 is taking care of you. Take it, delete the videos, and we'll both move on with our lives. Move on. Victoria laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You move on to your billions and your 3 wives and your perfect reputation. I move on to what? Back to being invisible? Back to working for people who see me as disposable. They argued for 40 minutes, the conversation cycling through the same territory. Him trying different tactics, bargaining, offering to add another $400,000 to make it an even $500,000. Threatening, reminding her that people who tried to extort his family tended to face consequences. Pleading, invoking his children who didn't deserve to see their father humiliated. Her holding firm on her demand, then shifting to moral arguments about accountability, about how maybe public exposure would force him to get real help for his addiction, about how he needed to take responsibility for his choices. By 9:47 p.m., they'd reached an impasse. Neither was willing to move. The conversation had devolved into attacks. Him calling her a gold digger who'd seduced a drug-impaired man and then exploited him. Her calling him an entitled addict who used people and discarded them when convenient. You know what? Victoria said, her frustration boiling over into reckless action. Fine. You won't pay? I'm sending everything to Gulf News right now. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, opened her email app with shaking fingers, started typing, subject line, exclusive Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla drug addiction and affair evidence. She began attaching the video compilation file, her movements deliberate, wanting him to see exactly what she was doing. I'm serious, she said, her finger hovering over the send button. Last chance. Transfer the $5 million tonight or this goes to every journalist in Dubai. Sheikh Jamal watched her finger move toward that button, and in that moment, something snapped inside him. He saw his entire life evaporating. The foundation he'd built, hospitals with his name on them being renamed. His 3 wives filing for divorce, taking his children, destroying his family. Business partners distancing themselves publicly. His father's disappointed face, 3 generations of family honor destroyed because he'd been weak, because he trusted the wrong person, because this woman who should have been grateful was instead destroying him. The rage that erupted wasn't a choice. It was a narcissistic wound so deep that violence became the only response his drug-hazed mind could process. He moved without conscious thought, grabbing her phone hand, twisting it viciously until she cried out and the phone clattered to the marble floor with a crack. She tried to pull away, screaming now, and his hands found her throat. Victoria fought desperately. She clawed at his face, drawing blood, scratches that would later provide DNA evidence. She landed defensive wounds on his arms, her broken nails leaving marks. She was small but strong from years of physical nursing work, and she understood what was happening, understood she was fighting for her life. But Sheikh Jamal was larger, stronger, and consumed by a rage that made him impervious to pain. He strangled her for 2 to 3 minutes, the medical examiner would later determine. Sustained pressure consistent with intentional homicide rather than a brief loss of control. Victoria Luz Ramos died at approximately 9:50 p.m. on March 14, 2024, on the marble floor of the apartment he'd given her, killed by the man she'd once believed cared for her. Her last conscious thoughts were a mixture of regret, terror, and bitter irony. She'd spent her entire life fighting to survive, to lift herself and her family out of poverty, to build something better. And it all ended here because she dared to believe she deserved respect from someone who'd never seen her as fully human. When the rage finally cleared and Sheikh Jamal looked down at what he'd done, at Victoria's body with petechial hemorrhaging marking her face and neck, at the blood pooled beneath her head where it had struck the floor, the full horror of his actions crashed over him. He vomited in her bathroom. He hyperventilated, chest pain so severe he thought he might be having a heart attack. For several minutes he couldn't move, couldn't think, could only stare at the evidence of his crime. Then survival instinct kicked in, the desperate need to undo what couldn't be undone, to hide what couldn't be hidden. He grabbed her phone from where it had fallen, smashed it repeatedly against the marble counter until it was unrecognizable fragment. Found her laptop, yanked out the hard drive, smashed the screen. An iPad in her bedroom, destroyed. He tore through her apartment, frantically searching for any other devices, USB drives, backup phones, anything that might contain the videos. Overturned drawers, rifled through closets, left a trail of destruction that would make it obvious this was about more than just murder. He stuffed the destroyed electronics into his duffel bag along with the cash he'd brought. At 11:23 p.m., his hands still shaking so badly he could barely dial, he called Hassan. "I need you at Sapphire Residence Tower. Unit 2804. Now. Alone. Bring cleaning supplies." Hassan arrived at 11:47 p.m. to find a scene that couldn't be cleaned, couldn't be fixed, couldn't be covered up no matter how much money or influence the Almwala family possessed. He found Victoria's body in the living room. He found Sheikh Jamal sitting against the wall, blood on his hands and clothes, eyes vacant with shock. He found the destroyed apartment, the smashed electronics, the evidence of panic-driven destruction. Hassan al-Mazrui had handled many difficult situations for the Almwala family over 15 years. But this crossed a line he couldn't uncross. A woman was dead. Not from an accident, not from a medical crisis, but from murder. Even with all the family's wealth and connections, this couldn't be buried. At 11:47 p.m., Hassan made the call to Dubai Police Emergency Dispatch. "There's been a death at Sapphire Residence Tower, Unit 2804. It appears to be a domestic incident. The involved party is still on scene." As sirens approached in the distance, Sheikh Jamal Almwala sat in silence, the man who had everything now having lost it all in 3 minutes of rage. And Victoria Luz Ramos lay dead at his feet, the woman who tried to leverage his secrets for security, having paid the ultimate price for daring to believe she deserved dignity. Their story was about to become international news, a cautionary tale that would force 2 continents to confront uncomfortable truths about power, migration, wealth, and the deadly consequences of treating human beings as disposable. Detective Rashid Al-Hamadi had seen murder scenes before, dozens of them across 18 years with Dubai Police Criminal Investigation Division, but something about this case felt different from the moment he stepped into Unit 2804 at 11:52 p.m. Maybe it was the sheer wealth on display, luxury that made most crime scenes look squalid by comparison. Maybe it was the identity of the suspect, still standing near the windows when police arrived, making no attempt to flee or resist. Or maybe it was the obvious desperation in how the scene had been torn apart, the frantic searching that spoke of someone trying to destroy evidence they knew would destroy them. The victim lay in the center of the living room, a small woman in medical scrubs, petechial hemorrhaging marking her face and neck like a constellation of broken blood vessels. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms told a story of someone who'd fought hard to survive. The pool of blood beneath her head came from impact with the marble floor during the struggle, not from the strangulation itself. Time of death would be estimated at 9:45 to 9:55 p.m., less than 2 hours before police arrival. The suspect was immediately cooperative in the way that people in shock sometimes are, answering questions before his lawyer could arrive to shut him down. "She was blackmailing me," Sheikh Jamal said, his voice flat, emotionless, threatening to release private videos. "We argued. Things got physical. I didn't mean to." He trailed off, perhaps realizing even through his drug-hazed shock that he was confessing to murder. But it was the scene itself that told the real story. Overturned furniture from the struggle. A pink iPhone with cracked screen lying near the kitchen. A MacBook Air torn apart, screen separated from keyboard, hard drive yanked free. An iPad smashed beyond recognition. A Louis Vuitton duffel bag containing $100,000 in cash and the destroyed remains of electronic devices. This wasn't a crime of passion that ended when the victim died. This was murder followed by frantic attempt at cover-up, someone who understood exactly what evidence existed and tried desperately to destroy it. The forensic team worked through the night, documenting everything with photographs and measurements and evidence bags. They collected the destroyed electronics, hoping against likelihood that data might be recoverable. They swabbed Sheikh Jamal's hands for gunshot residue, unnecessary given the cause of death but standard protocol. They collected skin cells from beneath Victoria's fingernails, though DNA confirmation was almost redundant given that he was still present at the scene. They cataloged the gifts throughout the apartment, designer clothes with tags still attached, jewelry in boxes from Cartier and Bulgari, evidence of a relationship that had involved significant financial investment. By 3 a.m., Detective Al-Hamadi had the basic outline of what had happened, but he understood the deeper story would emerge from digital forensics. If Victoria had been blackmailing Sheikh Jamal with videos, those videos existed somewhere. People didn't destroy electronics this thoroughly unless the data on them was catastrophically damaging. The question was whether she'd been smart enough to back them up somewhere he couldn't reach. The answer came on December 16th, when digital forensics specialist Dr. Youssef Rahman accessed Victoria's email account via subpoena and discovered she'd been using Cloud Secure Pro, an automatic backup service that uploaded all photos and videos from her phone to encrypted cloud storage. The destroyed phone didn't matter. The smashed laptop was irrelevant. Everything Victoria had recorded over 14 months was preserved in the cloud, over 200 gigabytes of data that Sheikh Jamal's frantic destruction had never touched. What they found was devastating. 147 video files, time-stamped from November 2022 through November 2023, documenting the entire arc of their relationship. Intimate footage showing both Victoria and Sheikh Jamal clearly identifiable, removing any possibility of denial. Audio of conversations about business dealings where he casually discussed bribing government officials, $50,000 payments to ministry officials to expedite hospital construction permits. Videos showing him self-administering opioid injections, the progression of his addiction visible across months of footage. Clips where he spoke disparagingly about his 3 wives, calling them business arrangements and social obligations rather than partners. But it was the WhatsApp message history that provided the motive. Victoria's demand, carefully worded and professional, asking for $5 million and assistance securing Canada residency in exchange for deletion of all files and complete confidentiality. Sheikh Jamal's attempted negotiation, offering $100,000 as a goodwill settlement. Victoria's refusal and her final threat, 72 hours before everything goes public. The draft email to Gulf News found in her account, subject line about exclusive evidence, never sent because she'd been killed before she could press send. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Fatima Al-Najjar, reviewed the evidence and knew immediately this would be the highest profile case of her career. This wasn't crime of passion, she told her team during their strategy session. This was premeditated rage. The defendant had time to calm down, brought insufficient payment knowing it would be rejected, traveled alone without security which was unusual for him, used a burner phone, told no one his location. These are actions of someone planning violence, not negotiation. The impact on the Al-Mualla family was immediate and catastrophic. Within 48 hours, the Foundation's board suspended all operations pending investigation. Sheikh Jamal's 3 wives filed for divorce simultaneously, a coordinated action that suggested they'd been consulting with lawyers even before his arrest. Business partners began publicly distancing themselves, releasing statements about being shocked and horrified, severing ties with someone they'd worked with for decades. Hospitals that bore the Al-Mualla Foundation name began quietly discussing rebranding. Donors demanded refunds and audits, wanting to ensure their charitable contributions hadn't funded anything improper. The trial began on March 15, 2025, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Victoria's murder. The prosecution charged first-degree murder premeditated, destruction of evidence, attempted fraud cover-up, and separate drug possession charges. The defense, led by prominent Dubai attorney Omar al-Rashid, argued that Sheikh Jamal was himself a victim, a man exploited by a calculating woman who'd seduced him while he was impaired by prescription medications, recorded him without consent, then attempted to extort millions. Prosecutor Al-Najjar's opening statement laid out the case with devastating clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a man who believed his wealth placed him above consequences. Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla had everything, billions of dollars, international respect, a devoted family. But that wasn't enough. He wanted more. He wanted freedom from responsibility. So he developed a secret life, drug addiction, an affair with his nurse, a complete betrayal of everyone who trusted him. And when that secret life threatened to become public, he made a choice. He chose murder over accountability. He chose to silence Victoria Ramos permanently rather than face the consequences of his own actions. The evidence presented over 6 weeks of trial was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified about the cause of death: asphyxiation due to manual strangulation with sustained pressure for 2 to 3 minutes, intentional rather than accidental. Digital forensics experts explained the cloud storage, how Victoria's automatic backups had preserved everything Sheikh Jamal tried to destroy. Financial investigators traced the money, the apartment lease in Victoria's name, the Mercedes registration, the jewelry purchases, establishing the relationship's financial dimension. Psychological profilers analyzed the power dynamic, the inherent inequality between a billionaire employer and a migrant worker employee, the impossibility of genuine consent in such an imbalanced relationship. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Layla Hassan, the chief medical examiner, who methodically explained Victoria's injuries. The defendant strangled her for 2 to 3 minutes. That's not a brief loss of control. That's sustained, intentional action. The victim fought desperately, as evidenced by defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, scratches she inflicted on her attacker. But he didn't stop. He maintained pressure until she died. This was murder, not manslaughter. The defense's strategy of portraying Sheikh Jamal as a victim of exploitation fell apart under cross-examination. When prosecutor Al-Najjar questioned him directly, the exchange was devastating. "You initiated the relationship with Ms. Ramos, correct?" "It was mutual," Sheikh Jamal replied. "She was your employee. You had all the power in that dynamic. You paid her salary, provided her housing, controlled her work visa status. Yet you claim it was mutual? She was attracted to my wealth. She pursued me. Did you force her to sign a non-disclosure agreement before the relationship started?" "No." "Did you ever explicitly tell her you would marry her or leave your wives?" "Silence." "When she asked for $5 million, 0.15% of your net worth, why not just pay it?" "It wasn't about the money," Sheikh Jamal said. "It was about being controlled, about her thinking she could threaten me. So you chose to control the situation permanently by taking her life?" The defense had no effective response. The video evidence was too clear, the forensic evidence too strong, the digital trail too complete. Sheikh Jamal's own words in his initial statement to police, before his lawyer arrived, had been recorded and were played for the jury. "She was blackmailing me. We argued. Things got physical. A confession that couldn't be walked back." Victim impact statements brought many in the courtroom to tears. Victoria's mother, Rosa Ramos, testified via video link from Manila, speaking in Tagalog with translation. "My daughter worked her entire life to lift our family out of poverty. She sent money every month so her siblings could go to school. She sacrificed her own happiness so we could have better lives. That man took her from us because she dared to ask for respect. In his world, workers like my daughter are disposable. But to us, she was everything." Victoria's siblings submitted written statements describing her role as family provider, her dreams of eventually returning to Manila to open a small medical clinic for poor communities. All dreams ended in a Dubai apartment by a man who valued his reputation over her life. Interestingly, prosecution also presented statements from Sheikh Jamal's own family. His eldest son Rashid, now 20 years old, submitted a statement saying, "My father's actions have brought shame to our family name. What he did was indefensible." His first wife Amira wrote, "I mourn for Ms. Ramos and her family. They deserved better." The family's public distancing was strategic but also appeared genuine, a recognition that what had happened couldn't be defended or minimized. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before reaching their verdict. On April 28, 2025, they returned to a packed courtroom where international media had been granted rare access. Sheikh Jamal stood as Judge Khalid Al-Maktoum read the verdict. On the count of first-degree murder, guilty. On the count of destruction of evidence, guilty. On the count of attempted fraud cover-up, guilty. Victoria's family, present via video link from Manila, wept with relief. Filipino community members in the courtroom gallery erupted in applause before being quickly silenced by bailiffs. Sheikh Jamal showed no emotion, simply nodded once, as if confirming a business transaction he'd expected. Sentencing came on May 15, 2025. Judge Al-Maktoum's statement was measured but firm. "Sheikh Jamal Al-Mualla, you were born into privilege that most people cannot imagine. You were given opportunities, education, wealth, respect. Instead of using these blessings responsibly, you chose deception, addiction, and ultimately murder. You killed Victoria Ramos not because she threatened your life, but because she threatened your image. You valued your reputation more than her existence. This court cannot and will not tolerate such callous disregard for human life. The sentence was life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for destruction of evidence to run concurrently. Additionally, the court ordered forfeiture of assets, 50% to Victoria's family as restitution, 50% to migrant worker advocacy organizations. He was permanently banned from holding any corporate positions, and his name would be removed from all foundation projects. The aftermath rippled across 2 continents. The Almwala family business empire collapsed within months. The foundation dissolved, hospitals renamed, the family fortune reduced by an estimated 60% through legal settlements and business losses. Sheikh Jamal's children changed their surnames, seeking distance from a legacy now synonymous with murder rather than philanthropy. Victoria's family received approximately $1.6 billion in total settlements. Rosa Ramos established the Victoria Luz Ramos Foundation in Manila, providing nursing scholarships for underprivileged Filipino students and funding legal advocacy for overseas Filipino workers facing abuse. Miguel, Sofia, and Paulo all completed university education funded by the settlement, transforming the trajectory of a family that had known only poverty for generations. The case prompted systemic changes. UAE labor laws were reformed to provide new protections for domestic and medical workers, mandatory independent monitoring of live-in employee conditions, criminalization of passport confiscation, anonymous reporting systems for workplace abuse. The Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs strengthened pre-deployment training, focusing on recognizing exploitation warning signs and enhanced embassy support. Dr. Samira Khalid, a forensic psychologist, provided post-trial analysis that would be published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology. Sheikh Jamal exhibited classic narcissistic entitlement combined with substance abuse disorder. His worldview positioned people as existing to serve his needs. When Victoria asserted her own value, his ego couldn't tolerate it. The murder was rage at being challenged by someone he considered inferior. Victoria's decision-making was shaped by survival instinct born from lifelong poverty. The blackmail wasn't about greed, it was about securing safety. She'd spent her life one crisis away from destitution. The videos were insurance against being discarded with nothing. The tragic irony is that if he'd simply paid the $5 million, this would have been a private scandal. Instead, his refusal to value her dignity cost him everything. If this story made you think about power, privilege, and the value of human life, hit that like button. Share this video to spread awareness about migrant worker rights. Subscribe for more stories that expose uncomfortable truths about our world. 2 people from opposite ends of the economic spectrum, both made choices driven by fear, desperation, and desire for control. Sheikh Jamal Almwala was born into extraordinary privilege and squandered it through selfishness. Victoria Luz Ramos was born into poverty and fought her entire life to escape it, only to be killed when she dared to demand dignity. Only one survived to face consequences. What would you have done in Victoria's position, trapped in a relationship with a powerful man who was discarding you? What does this case teach us about how society values certain lives over others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, every decision we make has consequences we can't always predict. Sometimes the price of those decisions is measured in blood.